.32 caliber by Donald McGibney, Chapter 5. Accident or Murder. Have you ever had the whole world stop for you? Well, that's what happened when that young intern told me that Jim was dead. I must have been half mad for a few moments. At least they said I acted that way. Sometimes tragic news deadens the senses, like the brief numbness that follows the sudden cutting off of a limb, the pain not manifesting itself until some time afterward. But with me, the fact of Jim's death clawed and tore at the very foundation of my brain. It stamped itself into my sensibilities with such a crushing force that I writhed under the burden of its bitter actuality. I felt as though I, myself, had died, and my spirit, snatched from the brilliant, airy sunlight of life, had been plunged into the hammering emptiness of hell. Jim is dead. Big, happy, kind-hearted Jim is dead, ached through my brain. They gave me something to drink, ammonia, I think, and my whirling head began to clear. "Can I see Mrs. Felderson?" I asked the intern. It was he who had given me the ammonia. "I'm afraid not," he replied. "She is being prepared for the operating table." "There is a chance, then, of her being saved?" I clutched at his arm. He slowly shook his head. "One chance in 1,000 only, I'm afraid. There was a severe concussion of the brain and a slight displacement of one of her cranial vertebrae. Luckily, Dr. Forbes is here, and if anyone can save her, he can." He got up from the seat beside me. "Now, Mr. Thompson, I advise you to go home and get a good night's rest. You can do nothing here, and the next few days are bound to be a great strain." "You will telephone me at once the result of the operation?" I asked quickly. "I wouldn't count too much on the operation," he said kindly, "but yes, I will let you know." He turned and walked back toward Helen's room. Just then the door was opened, and there appeared a sort of elongated baby cab without a top. On this wheeling table was a still white bundle, from which a stifled moan escaped now and then. Shaken with terror and nausea, I ran for the stairs, and did not stop until I got into my car and was racing away. As I drove, my brain cleared, and I remembered that there were others to whom the tragedy was almost as vital as to myself, and who ought to be informed. I stopped at a corner drugstore and called up Mary. Mother should not be told until a physician could assure me that she was strong enough to stand the shock. Mary was wonderfully sympathetic and tender, not voluble the way some women would have been. She asked me if I had been to the scene of the accident, and when I told her I was just going, she asked me if I wanted her with me. As it was after 10 o'clock and the rain had begun again, I told her no, and added that I'd come to see her in the morning. When I left the telephone booth, the drug clerk stared at me inquisitively. "You look all fagged out," he said frankly. "I'm not feeling very well," I replied, struggling into my raincoat. "Better let me give you something to fix you up," he suggested. I acquiesced, and he went to the shelf and shook some white powder into a glass. Then he put some water in it, and it fizzed merrily. I drank it at a gulp and climbed into the car, starting for the second bridge on the Blandesville Road. The drink braced me up, and as I drove I began to recall the events of the last few days, and for the first time to wonder if they had any connection with the tragedy. Captain Wadsworth had told me it was an accident. Could Frank Woods have been in any way responsible? No, certainly not, for Helen had been in the car, and he surely would never have done anything to put her life in jeopardy. But Woods didn't know that she was there. He had told Jim to come out alone, had insisted on it, in fact. It was Jim's idea to bring Helen with him. My heart was doing 100 revolutions to the minute. Now that I had hit on this idea, every fiber of my being cried out that Frank Woods was in some way responsible. I tried to urge my car to more speed. The wreck would surely tell me something. I determined to hunt every inch of ground around that place for a clue. Woods would have to prove to me that he had nothing to do with the accident before I believed him innocent. I drove up the long hill overlooking the little bridge that had suddenly assumed such a tragic significance in my life. It lies at the bottom of a hill about halfway between the city and the country club, and on the loneliest stretch of the entire road. There are no houses about, the city not having grown that far out, and the soil being entirely unusable for farming. In fact, there are only one or two large trees nearby to break the desolate expanse, the vegetation consisting mostly of thorny bushes springing from the rocky soil. There have been several accidents at that bridge, for its narrowness is deceiving and it is impossible for two autos to pass. Motorists going to the club usually let their cars out on the long hill, and if another car coming around the bend from the opposite direction reaches the bridge at the same time, only skillful driving and good brakes can avoid a smash-up. The matter has been brought to the attention of the authorities several times, but nothing has ever been done, either to widen that bridge or to warn automobiles of the danger. As I reached the top of the hill, I saw that two automobiles had stopped at the bottom, and, noticing that their lights blinked as people passed back and forth in front of them, I was convinced that a small crowd had gathered, probably out of curiosity. I slowed up as I neared the spot and came to a stop at the side of the road. A motorcycle cop walked up to my car. "Inspector Robinson, sir?" "No," I answered. "I am Warren Thompson, brother-in-law of Mr. Felderson, who had the accident." "How did it happen, do you know, Sergeant?" "It was the fault of the bridge again, sir. I told the chief that something ought to be done. This is the third accident in 6 months. We've been trying to find the other car." "What other car?" I asked. "The car that made Mr. Felderson take the ditch," he explained. "He must have been driving fast. He usually did. Many's the time I've had to warn him. And must have seen the other car would meet him at the bridge. He stopped too quick, skidded off the road and turned over in the creek." I shuddered as I pictured the scene. One of the automobiles turned around and the lights picked out the upturned wheels of Jim's car. It looked like some monster whose back had been broken. It was a large Peckworth-Pierce touring car, and the force of the crash had twisted and smashed the huge chassis. Several men were gathered around the car, examining it with the aid of a barn lantern. "Where were the bodies found?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Mrs. Felderson was over there on the bank. She was thrown out likely when the car left the road. Mr. Felderson's body was under the machine." While the thought of the heavy weight crushing the life out of Jim sickened me, I thanked God that the death must have been instantaneous. He pointed to a man standing by the wreck. "That man over there? He found them and took them to the hospital after sending one of his friends to notify the police." The man evidently heard our voices and came over to us. "Is this the inspector?" he asked. "No," I replied. "I am Mr. Felderson's brother-in-law." "Oh, I'm sorry," he said quickly. "May I express my deep, deep sympathy?" "Thank you. Will you tell me how you discovered the accident?" "I had been out to Blandesville on business and was returning with a party of friends. As we neared the bridge, one of them caught sight of the upturned automobile in the creek and we stopped. We found Mrs. Felderson first, being attracted by her moans. We went at once to the car, and as there were 4 of us, we were able to lift the automobile sufficiently to get Mr. Felderson from under it. We knew that the woman was still living, but none of us was a doctor enough to tell whether Mr. Felderson was alive or not. We carried them quickly to our car and hurried to St. Mary's, dropping one of my friends at the North District Station to inform the police what had occurred. Afterward we drove back here, thinking we might be wanted in case there was an investigation." "Did you see the lights of any car ahead of you as you came along the road?" I asked. "Did any car pass you, going in the same direction?" A car turned in ahead of us from the Millerstown road about 10 minutes before. Do you think that might be the car that was partly responsible for this accident?" I queried. Of course, no one could be sure in a situation of that kind, but I wouldn't doubt it at all. It left us behind as if we were tied. Another car had driven up while we were talking, and our policeman had gone over to it at once. He came back now, accompanied by a short, heavy-set man in plain clothes. "I am Inspector Robinson, detailed to examine into this affair. Were you the man who discovered the accident?" he asked, addressing my companion. "Yes, Inspector. Pickering is my name. I'm with the Benefit Insurance Company." He told of the circumstances of the discovery to the plain-clothes man, who, all the time Pickering was talking, bustled up and down and around the car. Finally he made Pickering show him just where the bodies lay. "Distressing, distressing," the inspector chirped. "Dreadful accident. Dreadful indeed, but quite to be expected with fast driving. If they will risk their lives—" "Inspector," I broke in, "I am the brother-in-law of the man who drove that car. While he was a fast driver, he was not a careless one. I've never known him to have an accident before." The little man irritated me. "That's the way it always happens," came back at me. "They take risks a dozen times and get away with them, and then blooey!" "But aren't you going to find the other car?" I demanded. "What other car?" he snapped. "The one that must have been coming from the opposite direction, that caused this accident." "Do you know there was any such car?" he bristled. "There must have been," I answered. "No accident has ever happened here except under such circumstances. Besides, Mr. Pickering saw a car turn into this road ahead of him not 10 minutes before the accident." Robinson looked from me to Pickering as though we were both conspiring to defeat justice. "Did you see such a car?" he barked at Pickering. "A car turned out of the Millerstown road and went toward the city about 10 minutes before we discovered the bodies," Pickering replied evenly. "Why didn't you say so?" the detective asked sharply. "What kind of a car was it?" "A black limousine with wire wheels. I couldn't see the number." Robinson's humor seemed to have come back. "Now we're getting on," he said, rubbing his hands. "That's better. That's much better. If you gentlemen had just told me that in the first place, we'd have saved all this time." He turned to the motorcycle policeman. "Feeney, go over to Millerstown and inquire if a black limousine with wire wheels stopped there tonight between 8 and 9 o'clock." A figure, unnoticed in the darkness, approached. It proved to be a lanky farmer, who spoke with a decided drawl. "I reckon I can help you thar. There was a big limousine touring car, wire wheels, went through Millerstown 'bout 8:30, quarter to 9. I know, 'cause it dern near run me down." "Do you live in Millerstown?" the inspector questioned. "Yep, came over to see the accident." "Did that auto stop in Millerstown?" The farmer chuckled and expectorated. "It didn't even hesitate." "Can you tell me anything else about it?" I spoke up. The inspector glared at me. "I'll conduct this investigation, Mr. The farmer scratched his head. "Well, nothin' much. It went too blame fast for me to git more'n a good look. But I did see that it was full o' men, and the tail light were busted, and they wasn't no license on it." "You sure of that?" the inspector asked. "Yep," he said. "I'm sure, 'cause I was goin' to report 'em." Again the inspector turned to Feeney, who had been listening intently. "Feeney, go in and tell the chief to issue instructions to all the force to keep an eye out for a black limousine with wire wheels and a broken tail light and no license tag. My friend," he said, turning to the farmer, "I thank you for your information. By tomorrow night we'll have that car and the parties concerned. By gad! They had their nerve running away after the accident. The damn rascals, killing people and then running away. I'll grill their toes for them." The malice of the little detective! his readiness to jump from one conclusion to another, reminded me for all the world of some disagreeable little barking dog that chases every passing vehicle. I bade him good night, shook hands with Pickering, and was on my way back to my car when another automobile drove up. 3 men jumped out, and as they passed in front of the lamps, I recognized Lawrence Brown and Fred Paisley from the club. The third man was Frank Woods. As I caught sight of his well-set-up figure, all the hatred I had for him seemed to rise in my throat and choke me. Try as I would, I couldn't separate him from the tragedy. When the farmer said the black limousine was full of men, I realized that Frank Woods couldn't have been one of them, and yet so great was my distrust of the man that I felt like accusing him on the spot. Larry Brown caught sight of me and wrung his hands. "Damn it, old man, I can't tell you how sorry I am." Paisley patted me on the back. "If there's anything we can do, Thompson." I shook my head and tears came to my eyes. They made me realize poignantly how much I had lost. Woods didn't join us. He knew if he tried to sympathize with me after the affair of the other day, I would throttle him for his hypocrisy. "Was Jim killed outright?" Brown asked. "Yes, and there's 1 chance in 1,000 for Helen." Both men started. Was Mrs. Felderson there? "They telephoned us at the club that Jim had been killed, but we didn't know she was with him." They glanced at each other and then at Woods, who was standing by the side of the overturned car. "You'd better tell him, Larry," Paisley muttered. "Doesn't he know?" I asked. "Of course not," replied Brown. "He was out there at the club with us. I'm afraid it will hit him awfully hard." He stepped over to Woods, and taking him by the arm, they disappeared into the darkness. We heard a choking cry, and the next moment Woods came running toward us. His face was distorted with horror, and his eyes were almost starting from his head. "Thompson, for God's sake, tell me he lies! Tell me he lies!" he shrieked. "Helen wasn't in that car." The old suspicions came tumbling back, and 100-fold. I turned cold all over. "It is true," I said. "Mrs. Felderson is in the hospital at the point of death." With a stifled groan, Woods sank to the ground and buried his face in his shaking hands. 32 caliber by Donald McGibney, Chapter 6. A Clue and a Verdict. I drove home with my thoughts in tumult. The look on Wood's face and the vehemence of his words made me sure he was in some way responsible for Jim's death. I walked the floors for hours trying to build up my case against him. He had sworn to kill Jim unless he let Helen go, and he must have known that afternoon that not only was Jim going to keep Helen from him, but that he had the proof with which to ruin him forever. He had planned to have it out with Jim at the country club, knowing it would be a cold, damp night and that few people would be out there. He had emphatically stated that Jim should come alone and should be there promptly at 8:30. All those facts pointed to a man's guilt, and I felt sure that in some way I should be able to unearth the proof. I knew I ought to sleep, but sleep was the last thing I could do. Twice I called up the hospital to inquire after Helen, but they could tell me nothing. Had the operation been successful? Yes, she had come through it. Would she get well? Ah, that they could not say. They would let me know if there was any change. I sent a telegram to Jim's uncle in the West, the only relative Jim ever corresponded with, and told him to notify any others to whom the news would be of vital interest. Toward 5 o'clock, when dawn was just graying the windows, I threw myself on the bed. I suddenly realized I was extremely tired, yet my brain was buzzing like a dynamo. Pictures and scenes from the last few days flashed through my mind. The vindictive look in Helen's eyes after the fight with Woods, that table being wheeled out of Helen's room at the hospital, with the moaning white bundle on it, the upturned car pricked out of the darkness by the automobile lamps, and finally Frank Wood's face when he heard that Helen had been in the car. With the realization that I ought to get up and close the window, where the morning breeze was idly flapping the curtain, I fell asleep. I woke with a start to find the room flooded with golden sunlight. A glance at the clock on the mantel-shelf showed me that it was after 9. My body was cramped and stiff, and I felt stale and musty from having slept in my clothes. It was only after a cold shower and a complete change that I felt refreshed enough to pick up the threads where I had dropped them the night before. Again, like the sudden aching of a tooth, came the heartbreaking realization that Jim was dead. With it came also anxiety for Helen's condition, so I called up the hospital at once. They could only say that she had not recovered consciousness, but she seemed to be resting comfortably. I went down to the office to tell the stenographers they might have a vacation until after the funeral, and to lock up. The first person I found there was Inspector Robinson, who was calmly reading over the correspondence on Jim's desk. With all the sang-froid in the world, he met my infuriated gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. Thought there might be something here, touching on the case." He waved a hand towards Jim's letter basket. "Have you found the black limousine?" I asked. "Certainly, my dear man, certainly. We not only found the car, but we found the people who were in the car, and they know nothing about the accident." My first explanation was the right one, and I knew it would be. Felderson was driving recklessly, saw the bridge, put on the brakes, skidded, and was killed. "But why should he put on the brakes at the bridge?" I queried. "I've thought of that," he smiled. "Perfectly logical. There's a nasty bump at the bridge, and he naturally didn't want to jar Mrs. Felderson." "So he turned into the ditch and pitched her out on her head instead," I jeered. "That's all poppycock. I've taken that bridge at full speed 100 times without a jar." "It's immaterial anyway," he snapped, frowning at me. "You can't make any fool mystery out of it. The point is that Mr. Felderson put on his brakes rapidly, perhaps for a dog or a rabbit, and skidded into the ditch." "It's not immaterial," I burst out angrily. "There was a real reason for his putting on the brakes rapidly. He was afraid of hitting something, or of being hit himself. Who was the driver of that other car?" "The son of one of the biggest men in the state, Carl Schreiber." "Carl Schreiber!" I cried. "The son of the German socialist, who was put in jail for dodging the draft?" I grabbed him by the arm. "Quick, man! Who were the others with him?" Robinson gazed at me with a stupid frown. "2 reporters from the Sun, a fellow by the name of Pedersen, Otto Metzger, and that Russian Zalnik who just got out of prison." "Zalnik!" I yelled exultantly. Zalnik, the man Jim had sent to prison, and who had threatened revenge. Metzger, who had been his accomplice all along. Schreiber, who hated Jim and all the virile Americanism that he stood for. Peterson and the 2 reporters I didn't know, but they were no doubt of the same vile breed. A fine gang of cutthroats who would have liked nothing better than to get rid of Jim. They probably saw his big searchlight that makes his car easily recognizable, and realized their opportunity had come. They had driven toward him as though to smash into him, and made Jim take the ditch to get out of the way. That explained the sudden jamming on of his brakes that had caused him to skid and overturn. All these thoughts passed through my mind as I heard the names of the men in the black limousine. "Inspector," I said, "I'm fully convinced that the men in that black limousine are responsible for my brother-in-law's accident." "What makes you think that?" he demanded, eyeing me narrowly. "Because all of them had a reason to hate and fear my brother-in-law. Zalnik, since his release, had sworn he would get even with Mr. Felderson for putting him in prison. Metzger felt the same way. As for Schreiber, I'm sure if he could have manipulated that car so as to cause an accident to Mr. Felderson, he would have done it." "You're crazy," Robinson sneered. "This thing's gone to your head. How could they have known it was your brother-in-law's car?" "By the big searchlight on the front. It's the only car in the state with such a searchlight. Mr. Felderson's car was so fast that the police sometimes used it, and he had their permission to wear that light, as you probably know. Also, it may have been dark enough to use the searchlight, and yet light enough so that the car could be distinguished at 100 feet. If there was any light at all, that big Peckwith-Pierce car could be recognized by anyone." He was impressed. I could see it by the thoughtful, shrewd look that came into his eyes. Already he was making arrests by the wholesale, in his mind. "But I can't go pulling these men for murder on such slight evidence as that," he exploded. "No one wants you to," I said sharply. "All I want you to do is help me find out whether those men were present when the accident happened." The idea of helping me didn't please him at all. As soon as I had spoken, I saw my error in not putting it the other way round. "Now, Mr. Thompson, you better keep out of this," he advised, getting to his feet. "I know that you are anxious to find out if these men had anything to do with Mr. Felderson's death, but the case is in good hands. We're professionals. We can do a lot better when there's no amateurs messing about. You leave it to me." "Just as you say," I acquiesced. "Get busy, though, and if you find out anything, let me know." Robinson stood a minute, turning his derby hat in his hands. I knew what he was after. "By the way," I added, "I'll pay all expenses." His face brightened at once. "Well now, that's good of you, Mr. Thompson. I wasn't going to suggest anything like that, but it'll help a lot." I handed over several bills which he pocketed with satisfaction. "Don't worry a minute, Mr. Thompson. We'll get those birds yet. I was pretty sure that they had something to do with it all the time. You've got the best man in the department on the job." He put on his derby hat with a flourish and trotted out the door. I recalled that I had told Mary I would see her, so I dismissed the stenographers and locked up the office. It was a perfect morning, with all the warm, spicy perfumes of Indian summer. Overhead a blue sky was filling with tumbled clouds of snowy whiteness. The rain of the night before was still on the grass and the trees, giving a dewy fragrance to the air that was invigorating. Now that I had found a possible solution to the tragedy, I was filled with enthusiasm. I felt that if I could bring Jim's murderers to trial, I would conduct such a case for the prosecution as would send them up for life. They had succeeded in carrying out their threats, but I would make them pay for it. I stopped in front of Mary's house and honked the horn. She opened the door and came quickly to the car. The tragic news of the night before had taken the laughter out of her eyes and the buoyancy from her step. "I could cry my eyes out, Bupps," she said as she climbed into the car. "Don't do it or I'll start too," I responded, a lump coming in my throat. "How did it happen?" she asked, as we drove away. "The papers gave a long account, but said it was an accident." "Zalnitch did it, Mary. At least I'm almost sure it was he." I told her what I had learned during the morning, and as I talked I finally touched on Frank Wood's strange words of the night before. "You don't think he had anything to do with it, do you, Bupps?" "No," I said. "I did think so, but I have changed my mind since this morning. I suppose it was just his grief that made him act so queerly." "He does love Helen, Bupps," Mary murmured. "Helen got quite confidential while she was staying with me, and the things she told me about Woods made me see that he really was in love with her." "Yes, I suppose he does love her," I responded, "but he had no right to take her away from Jim." "It's the man who takes a woman, whether he has the right or not, that wins," responded Mary seriously. I looked at her, wondering whether she was growing the least bit personal. She was looking straight ahead with an unsmiling gaze. As I glanced at her, there beside me, with the breeze blowing wisps of golden hair around her temples, I got panic-stricken. "Mary," I began. "Watch where you are going, Bupps." I fastened my eyes on the street ahead, but only for an instant. With Jim gone, I was going to be fearfully lonesome. I glanced at her again. "Mary, I know this isn't the right time or place, but—" "Let's go to the hospital and find out about Helen," she interposed quickly. She knew we were going there all the time. The mention of Helen brought me back to earth with a snap and made me realize I had no business talking about love at such a time. Yet never in my life did I feel more like telling Mary how much I wanted her. We had no sooner entered the cool hall of St. Mary's than the little interne with glasses, whom I had seen the night before, came hurrying up to me. "Mr. Thompson, we have been telephoning every place for you." My heart jumped to my throat. "Is Mrs. Felderson—" "No," he responded. "Mrs. Felderson is still unconscious. It's Mr. Felderson. The coroner has made an important discovery." I waved for Mary to stay where she was and hurried downstairs where Jim's body lay. It had not been moved before the coroner's inquest. The room was dark and several people were gathered around the inquest table. All eyes were turned on me as I entered the room. A portly man detached himself from the group and came toward me. "Mr. Thompson?" "Yes." "I am the coroner. In making my inquest, I find that death is not due to the automobile smash-up. Mr. Felderson was shot through the head, from behind. We have rendered a verdict of murder." 32 caliber by Donald McGibney, Chapter 7. I turned detective. Murdered? For a moment I was stupefied by the doctor's revelation, and then, as he went on to describe the course of the bullet and certain technical aspects of the case, a sudden rush of thankfulness came over me. Let me explain. The coroner had given a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. From the first moment I heard of the accident, I was certain there was something sinister about it, but had little on which to base my belief. The coroner's verdict substantiated my suspicions and gave me a chance to work in the open, to bring into court, if possible, the people I suspected. Murder by person or persons unknown? I knew the persons. Zalnitch, Metzger, Schreiber. They must have recognized the car as it came toward them, and taken a shot as they went by. My thoughts were recalled from their wanderings by an unexpected sentence of the coroner's. I had been following him vaguely, but now my attention was riveted. One could not be sure, because of the varied course that bullets take through the body, but the shot seemed to have been fired from above and behind. Unless it were otherwise proved, I'd strongly suspect that the murderer had fired the shot from the back seat of the car. "Of course that is impossible," I said, "because in that case the murderer would have been in the accident." "I had the same idea," he said slowly, giving me a searching look. "Helen?" I felt suddenly sick and faint. I wanted air, sunlight, to get away from that darkened room and those piercing eyes that seemed to read my thoughts. I thanked him for letting me know what he had discovered, and hurriedly excused myself. Helen! The blood pounded through my temples. God, no! Willful, spoiled woman, if you will, ready to leave her husband without thought of the consequences, to go with another man. But premeditated murder? 1,000 times, no! I felt that with the unworthy suspicion in my mind, I could not face Mary, and I waited a moment at the bottom of the stairs before going up to meet her. There were 2 questions that had to be answered. Was Helen in the back seat when the car left Mary's the evening before? And had Jim told Helen about the proofs he had of Wood's irregularities? Mary was probably there when Helen and Jim left and could answer both questions. I wiped the perspiration from my forehead and, assuming as calm an air as possible, went upstairs. Mary was chatting with the little intern, but as soon as she saw my face, she hurried toward me. "You look as though you'd seen a ghost. What was it, Bupps?" "Not here," I cautioned. "Wait until we get outside." We walked down the broad, sunlit steps and climbed into the car. I felt like a traitor to let Mary even think that I suspected Helen, but my questions had to be answered. "Will you have luncheon with me, Mary?" "Certainly," she answered. "Let's go to Luigi's. We can talk quietly there." I headed for downtown and kept my eyes on the road, dreading to put my question into words. "What was it, Bupps?" Mary asked. I decided to ask what I had to ask before telling her the coroner's verdict. "Did you see Helen leave the house with Jim yesterday?" "Yes, I was looking out the window when they started. Why?" I could hardly force myself to go on. Did Helen get into the front seat with Jim?" I faltered. "No, she climbed into the back," Mary replied. "They had some sort of an argument before they left. I knew Jim was excited and that Helen was angry. Of course, I didn't hear all that passed between them. I tried not to hear any, but they talked very loud and were right in the next room." "What did you hear?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Once Jim laughed, a hard sort of laugh, and I heard Helen say, 'You lie! You know you are lying. He will disprove everything you say.' Another time I heard Helen exclaim, 'Give me that pistol. You shan't threaten him while I'm there.' I knew, of course, they were speaking of Frank Woods, but I didn't know what it was all about. Why do you ask all this, Bupps?" "Mary," I said, and I couldn't look at her, "the coroner has given a verdict of murder." "Murder?" she gasped. I nodded. "Jim was shot from behind while he was driving Helen out to the country club to meet Woods, and Helen was in the back seat." "She didn't do it!" Mary burst out. "She couldn't have done it." "Of course she didn't do it," I exploded. We were glaring at each other as though each defended Helen from the other's accusation. "We know she didn't do it, but there are many who wouldn't take our word for it. I could see by the way the coroner looked at me this morning that he is ready to accuse her of murdering Jim, and it's up to us to save her by finding out who really is guilty." We drove up in front of Luigi's, and I was able to get a small table in the corner by ourselves. Although no one could have overheard us, I sat as near Mary as I could and we talked with our heads close together. Mrs. Webster Pratt came in the door just then with a luncheon party, and noticing how we were engrossed, came bouncing over to the table at once. "Poor Mr. Thompson, my heart bleeds for you, simply bleeds for you." I got to my feet and permitted her to squeeze my hand. She squeezes your hand or pats you at the least opportunity, and this was one unequaled. "Poor dear Mr. Felderson, it is such a loss. I was shocked to death when I heard it. And Mrs. Felderson, the poor child, is she going to I was afraid so when I read it in the paper. I'm surprised to find you here. How is your poor dear mother?" I knew that the woman would gossip all over the place about my heartlessness unless I explained my presence in a public cafe so soon after Jim's death and my sister's injury. "My mother doesn't know about it yet," I said quietly. "I didn't think her strong enough to stand the shock. I shouldn't have come here, but I had a very important matter to talk over with Miss Pendleton." "I could see that from the way you were sitting," she giggled. "I'm afraid that you are going to give Eastbrook something to talk about as soon as this distressing thing is over." She patted my arm and beamed at Mary and swished over to her party. "We shouldn't have come here, Mary," I said with a sour grimace. "I forgot that old cat sometimes comes here. She'll spread it all over town that you were down here making love to me before Jim was decently buried. She'll probably say we were engaged." "Well, I wish we were." I know I must have shown the longing in my eyes. "Don't, please, Warren," Mary whispered, putting her hand on my arm. "We've got too much to do. That Pratt woman drove everything out of my mind for a moment. I wish she hadn't seen us here." I didn't feel as though I could eat a thing, and neither did Mary, so I told the waiter to bring us a light salad, and sent him away. "Mary," I said after he was gone, "we know Helen didn't do this thing, but if you are called by the grand jury to tell what you just told me, they will bring an indictment against her in a minute." "They couldn't," Mary expostulated. "They couldn't believe such a thing." "Don't you think Mrs. Webster Pratt would believe it if she knew everything that we know?" I argued. "She'd believe it with only half as much proof, and she has just about as much mental equipment as the average juryman. There'll be about 4 of Mrs. Webster Pratts on that jury." "What can we do, Bupps?" Mary begged, with tears in her eyes. "Well," I said, "you've got to see Helen as soon as they let you, and as often as they'll let you, so that the first time she speaks you'll be able to hear what she says." "But suppose she dies, Bupps?" "Even while she is unconscious," I went on, disregarding her query, "she may say something that will give us a clue. I'm going out to the bridge right after lunch." "What for?" Mary asked. "To see if I can find Jim's revolver. If it had been found on Helen, the coroner would have told me this morning, I think." "Of course they may not have taken it at all. In that case it will still be at your house. If Helen took it with her, it must have fallen out when the car turned over, and if it did, I must get it before anyone else does." The waiter interrupted here with the salad. Mary dabbled with hers a bit and then said, "Bupps, hadn't I better get out of town?" "No," I replied. "They'd be sure to find you, and when you gave your testimony it would hurt Helen just that much more." "But I can't stand up before them and tell what I heard. I'll lie first." Her lovely little face clouded up as though she were going to cry. "You'll do nothing of the kind," I insisted. "We know Helen didn't do it, don't we?" "Yes." Her tone was not convincing. "Well then, whatever we say can't hurt her, and we're bound to find out who the guilty persons are." "But, Bupps, who could it have been?" she asked anxiously. "I still think it was Zalnitch and the men who were with him, but it might have been Woods. I'm going to find out everything he did last night. It may throw some light on the case. After all, he is the one who had the most to gain by Jim's death, and his words of last night were mighty queer." I paid the waiter and we left the cafe. On the way to Mary's I stopped at the undertaker's and made arrangements for Jim's burial. The man in charge was the saddest looking person I had ever seen. He had a woebegone look about him that was infectious, made you want to weep for him or with him. He discussed the funeral arrangements in a hushed voice and finished by whispering, "I sincerely hope what the papers are hinting is not so." "What's that?" I asked. "The noon edition of the Sun says, 'The finger of suspicion points very strongly to Mrs. Felderson.'" I hurried out to the car and jumped in. "Mary, we've got to work fast." "Is Helen suspected?" she asked. "Yes, the Sun is more than hinting." The news seemed to bring out the fight in Mary. "Well, we'll prove her innocent." When we reached the Pendletons, we hurried into the house and went at once to the room where Jim and Helen had their argument. The revolver was not there. 32 caliber by Donald McGibney, Chapter 8. It looks bad for Helen. I drove Mary to the hospital with my spirits at lowest ebb. If the Sun were going to try to convict Helen of the murder, I realized that we had a hard fight ahead of us, for that yellow sheet was most zealous in hounding down anyone who happened to be socially prominent and in demanding punishment. The blacker the scandal, the deeper they dug, and the more details they gave to their gluttonous, filth-loving public. They would be particularly eager here, for they had no love for Jim, due to the stand he took against them during the war. I knew the reporters would be hot on my trail and that sooner or later they would interview Mary, So I determined that Mary should spend as much time as possible at the hospital, feeling sure the reporters would not be allowed into the room where Helen lay, battered and unconscious. As for me, I wanted to get to the bridge on the Blandesville Road as quickly as possible, and from there to the country club to inquire what Woods had done the night before. I made up my mind I'd lead the reporters a merry old chase before they ran me to earth, and when they did, I'd tell them nothing. I also wanted to get in touch with Robinson as soon as I could, to find out whether he had discovered anything new of Zalnitch and his confederates, but that could wait until evening. At the hospital they were at first opposed to having anyone in the room with Helen, who still lay in a coma, but with the help of one of the nurses in charge it was at last arranged. As I drove over the road to the club, the bleak barrenness of the country struck me anew. 24 hours before Jim had been alive. 24 hours before we had been standing in our office discussing the proof of Wood's guilt, and Woods had telephoned to Jim, asking him to come to the country club alone. My suspicions of the man stirred afresh, so that when I came to the bridge and I found no one there, I decided to leave my search for the revolver until later, and go straight on to the club. It was still early for the golfers and the bridge players, and there were only a few people there. These, of course, came up to me and pressed my hand with genuine sympathy. I realized how many, many friends Jim had, and what a loss his death was to them all. As soon as I could disengage myself, I hunted up Jackson, the negro waiter and general houseman, who knows everything that happens at the club. He had just finished his dinner, and I drew him into the cloakroom so that our talk might be uninterrupted. I took out a $5 bill and held it up before his expectant eyes. "Do you see that, Jackson?" I questioned. "Yes, indeed, I sees it, sir. I may be gettin' old, but I ain't blind yit. I'll give you what you wants instantly." He started to leave, but I grabbed him. "That's not what I want, Jackson," I laughed. "Since the Prohibition law went into effect, it has been only through some such ritual that wets can get theirs at the club. All I want is to ask you a few questions." "For dat money?" His teeth gleamed. I nodded. "Mr. Woods was here last night?" I asked abruptly. "Yes, sir." "What time did he come in?" "I can't rightly say, Mr. Thompson, but he had dinner out here 'bout 7:30, he answered. "Did he leave the club after that?" "Not till de telephone call come what say Mr. Felderson been kilt. Den he lef with Mr. Brown and Mr. Paisley." "You sure he was here all that time?" I asked. "No, sir, I ain't, sir, but I seen him every now and then, through the evenin'." "Was he here at 8:15?" I questioned. "He was here at 25 minutes past 8. I knows, 'cause I done brought him a drink." "You sure of that?" "Yes, sir, positive," the negro answered, "'cause I look at de clock right den and dere." As near as I could figure, the accident had happened about 8:10 or 8:15, and the bridge was 6 miles away from the club. Woods couldn't have been at the bridge at the time of the tragedy and got back to the club by 8:25. Still, he might have had an accomplice. "Thank you, Jackson," I said, giving him the money. "Just forget that I asked you any questions." The darky chuckled. "I done forgot 'em before you asked 'em, sir. Thank you, sir." As I passed into the big central living room, Paisley came in. "What was this I saw in the Sun?" he asked. "The sort of rot that nasty sheet always prints," I said. "Nothing to it, of course. I thought not. You don't feel like golfing?" I shook my head. "Not today, old chap. By the way, were you with Frank Woods when the news of Jim's death reached the club?" "Yes. Why?" he asked. "You won't think it too strange if I ask you how he appeared to take it," I said, trying to make my remark seem as casual as possible. Seeing the puzzled expression on his face, I added, "I know it is a peculiar thing to ask, but please don't think any more about it than you can help, and just answer." "Why, Paisley began, a little flustered. "Why, he took it just the way the rest of us took it, I suppose. I don't remember exactly." "Did he seem surprised?" I questioned. "Of course," Paisley answered. "He didn't seem relieved?" "Say, what the devil are you driving at, Thompson?" Paisley burst out. I saw I could get nothing from him, so I left him looking after me with a perplexed and somewhat indignant gaze. As a detective, it seemed I might make a good plumber. I knew very well he would not repeat my questions, but it would be just like good old Paisley to worry himself to death trying to solve them. I drove back to the bridge, determined to find the revolver if possible, and then hunt up Inspector Robinson to learn what he had to report. Apparently my suspicions of Frank Woods were groundless. He had had dinner at the club and then waited around for Jim to keep his appointment. He had been seen by Jackson at 8:25. Jackson was positive of that fact. 10 or 15 minutes at the most in which to go 6 miles to the bridge and back to the club, put up his car and ask Jackson for a drink. The thing couldn't be done. He had heard of Jim's death with surprise, and had heard of Helen's injury with the greatest horror. There seemed to be no doubt of one thing: no matter how much he wished for Jim's death, no matter how much he benefited by the murder, Frank Woods himself didn't do the killing. An automobile was standing at the bridge when I got there, and I cursed the whim that had sent me to the club on a false scent and kept me from having an uninterrupted search for the weapon. When I saw, however, that the driver of the automobile was Inspector Robinson, I was greatly relieved, for this would not only give me a chance to learn what he had discovered concerning the men in the black limousine, but would not interfere with the search for Jim's gun. Robinson had his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, and was fishing around the edge of the little creek with his hands. So engrossed was he in his task that I was almost upon him before he looked up. "Good afternoon, Inspector," I addressed him. "What are you doing, digging for gold or making mud pies?" "I'm getting bait to catch a sucker," he snarled. "You must have thought you had one this morning." "What do you mean?" I asked. "All that bunk you handed me about Schreiber and the men in the black limousine. That was a fine stall you pulled. I might have known you were trying to cover up somebody's tracks." He dried his hands on a rather flamboyant yellow handkerchief. "I haven't the least idea what you are talking about," I replied coolly. "Oh, you haven't you?" the little man burst out malignantly. "You're innocent, are you? Too damn innocent. I suppose you didn't know that your brother-in-law was shot in the back of the head, and that your sister was the only one that was with him when it was done. I suppose that's news, eh?" My heart stood still as I heard his words. So he was after the proof that Helen did it. He read the insinuations in the Sun, and had abandoned his work against Schreiber and Zalnitch for the fresher trail. "I found out this morning that my brother-in-law was shot, but that only makes the case look the blacker for those who openly threatened his life." "Among whom was your beautiful sister?" the detective retorted acidly. "How do you know that?" I demanded. "From her maid and all the rest of the servants in the house. I found that out when I went up to take another squint at the automobile." "You thought you were pretty smart sending me on a wild goose chase after a couple of cracked socialists, when all the time you knew it was your own sister done the thing. Tried to keep me off the trail by slipping me a little dough. Well, it didn't work, see? There's your dough back." He threw a crumpled wad of bills on the ground at my feet. "No one saw you give it to me, but I ain't taking any chances. You might have marked those bills. From now on, I work alone without any theories from you." "Look here, Inspector," I demanded. "I was in earnest when I told you I wanted you to find out all you could about the men in the black limousine. I'm sure they had something to do with Mr. Felderson's death. I didn't try to bribe you nor throw you off the right track. Even though my sister did have a little unpleasantness with her husband, it was no serious difference." I determined to find out just how much Robinson knew. She was utterly incapable of doing an act like this. What possible motive could she have? I could see that Robinson was rather impatiently waiting for me to go before he continued his search. "Well, I ain't found out her motive yet. That can wait. It might have been money or jealousy." "Money," I scoffed. "My sister has plenty, more than she could use. And as for her being jealous of her husband, that is even more ridiculous." The little man eyed me angrily. "I said that the motive could wait. There's no tellin' what a society woman will do. She may have been crazy for all I know, but I ain't, and all your arguin' is just so much time wasted. You think those guys in the automobile done it? I don't. I think your sister done it. You don't. All right then. You take your road and I'll take mine, and we'll see who comes out ahead." He turned and started back to where he had been hunting when I came up. "May I ask what you expect to find here?" I queried, walking after him. "Sure, you can ask," he replied. As he found me following, he turned and snapped, "Say, what the hell are you hanging around here for anyway?" "I merely wanted to ask you what you had discovered about the men in the black limousine. That's why I stopped." "Well, you've found out, haven't you?" "Nothin'. All right then. You go on into the city and see if you can find out anything more." I walked on down the sloping bank, searching the ground to see if I could find the gun that might reveal so much. I could feel the eyes of the inspector boring into my back. "What are you looking for?" he demanded. "A cuff link," I answered easily. "I think I lost one here last night." "You didn't happen to find it, did you?" "A cuff link? Huh," he grunted. "No, I haven't found it, but I wouldn't be surprised if I was looking for that same cuff link." All this time I was searching the bank with my eyes. A scrubby little bush overhung the creek, and I kicked at it with my foot. There was a plop, as though something heavy had dropped into the water. Instinctively I knew it was the object for which we were both searching, and I turned to find the inspector eyeing me quizzically. "What was that noise?" "What noise?" I asked. "Sounded as though that precious cuff link of yours had dropped into the water." He started for me, and as he did so I bent down and plunged my hand into the water. My fingers closed on the revolver just as he came bounding toward me. With a quick shove I pushed it far into the soft clay of the bank, and grabbing a rock off the bottom of the creek, withdrew my arm from the water and slipped the rock into my pocket. The red-faced little detective was peering over my shoulder as I turned. Rarely have I seen a man so angry. "Give me what you pulled out of that creek!" he almost screamed. "What for, Inspector?" I asked quietly. "Never mind what for. You give me what you found in that creek or I'll—" He grabbed me by the shoulder. "All right," I said. "All right, Inspector. Don't get so excited over nothing. It's yours." I pulled the muddy rock from my coat pocket and gravely handed it to him. "It was only an ordinary, everyday rock. I didn't know you were a geologist." He pounced on me and ran his fingers over my person. Red-faced, he surveyed me. "I ain't a geologist, but I am a criminologist, and just one more of your monkey tricks like that, and I'll put you where you'll have time to study a lot of rocks and do a lot of thinking before being funny again. Now you get out. Get into that car as quick as you can, if you know what's good for you." Hoping I could retrieve the revolver later, and realizing that nothing could be gained by staying there longer, I started toward my car. I had hardly taken 5 steps when I heard a joyful yell and turned to see Robinson struggling to his feet, the muddy revolver in his hand. "Here's your cuff link," he cried. "Before I'm through, you'll find that this ain't a cuff link, but a necklace for the neck of that pretty sister of yours. You, with your socialists and your cuff buttons, trying to keep me from getting what I go after? Well, it didn't work. It don't usually when I go after something. It didn't work, did it?" "No, it didn't work," I admitted. "Oh, I don't blame you," Robinson went on, mollified by his success and the soft tone of my reply. "I'd have done the same thing in your place if my sister was a murderer." The word murderer acted like an electric shock on me. "She didn't do it, I tell you. She couldn't have done it." "Now, Mr. Thompson," Robinson began in a soothing voice, "these things happen in even the best families sometimes. You mustn't take it too hard." "Will you let me examine that revolver?" I demanded. "Why, no, I can't let you examine it, but I'll examine it when I get ready." "Will you be so good as to do it now?" I asked. "What for?" "Because it may not have been fired at all. That would make things look entirely different, you know." The inspector took out the gaudy handkerchief again and wiped the mud off the barrel and the grip. I had shoved the pistol barrel foremost into the bank so that the muzzle was filled with clay. It was Jim's, a .32 automatic. "It won't be spoilin' any evidence by my cleaning this mud off the outside, because you put that there yourself," the detective said, wiping the pistol carefully. He released the spring and pulled out the clip. I saw a cartridge at the top of the clip and exclaimed, "There, you see? That gun was never fired." The inspector looked at me with a pitying smile. "Now that's where you're wrong, Mr. Thompson. You see, you don't know the inner workings of an automatic. When a gun like this is fired, it discharges the old shell and a new cartridge comes to the top of the clip. There are only 3 cartridges left in this clip." "Do you mean to say that my sister fired more than one shot?" I asked sarcastically. "Not at all, not at all," the little man responded airily. "There were probably only 4 cartridges in the gun in the first place. You're getting all excited over this thing. Of course I don't blame you, Mr. Thompson, for trying to fight against facts, but it certainly looks bad for your sister." I got into my car and started home, my heart dead within me. It certainly did look bad for Helen.